Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues in education, Stephen looked around his audience. Not a bad turnout for the first day of a 3-day conference. He knew that almost 200 pairs of eyes were looking at him, their owners watching his every word, waiting for him to say something that they could praise, or something that they could attack and argue with. I don't need to tell you that bullying comes in many forms and has become part of our daily lives, and not just in our schools. He began absolutely sure of what he wanted to say and delivered it with confidence and style. From the first 10 seconds, he realized that he had them in the palm of his hand. I clearly remember how, in my second year of high school, the fact that he spoke from personal experience was one of the things that made Stephen such a compelling speaker. He knew his topic so well that he spoke on autopilot. He moved around the podium like a caged lion on a small stage, unable to stop waving, his arms clenching his fists, and his sparkling blue eyes riveted the audience to their seats. Here are Ted and Freddie from DFES and a couple of other familiar faces who will be propping up the bar today. Could be a nice evening. But while the kind of direct bullying we are all familiar with potentially results in physical errors, the psychological scars from indirect bullying can be much more damaging in the long run. These scars are usually... Before moving on to the core of his speech, cyberbullying, he asked the audience to self-analyze, to think about when they were involved in indirect bullying, social aggression, bullying. Almost everyone has at one time or another been part of a gang or group that criticized, picked on, or gossiped about someone to the point that that person became socially isolated. In other words, they bullied me. Stephen spoke more slowly now, in little more than a whisper, forcing the audience to concentrate, to look at him, to watch his lips. As he spoke, his eyes could see how many of those watching him were aware of this. He saw them begin to squirm in their seats, realizing that they had once, to one degree or another, been involved in bullying. As his eyes wandered around the room, they looked back for a moment, doing a double take. Wow, who the hell is she? Although he never knew all the participants at these conferences, there is a certain core of regulars. She was not one of them. As he caught his breath between sentences, his mind absorbed and memorized the image. Short, blonde, impeccably styled hair, gold, and what appears to be diamond earrings with a matching necklace. The white silk blouse is unbuttoned just enough to show that she is sexy and confident, but definitely not patient. Summer business suit, two-piece, peach-colored, expensive, tailored, perfect for her skin color. From his vantage point on the low stage, the skirt showed a hint of thigh. It's enough to bring up the old question in any man's mind. Stockings, in fact, no different from indirect bullying. It simply gives bullies an additional and globally common toolkit to increase suffering. Stephen was approaching the climax of his speech. The whole timbre of his voice was evangelical. He urged his acolytes to examine themselves, to ensure that they avoided harming others, no matter how innocent it might seem. But even more so, urging them to be vigilant and use the tools and techniques he spoke about to help eliminate bullying in our educational institutions and workplaces. But so that's it. Thanks for reading. I hope this was an hour of your time well spent and that you put into practice some of the techniques we've discussed to make our schools happier environments for all of us. Thank you. The applause was louder and more enthusiastic than at most similar conferences. Stephen acknowledged them with polite nods, but stood even taller on stage with a boyish grin. The chairman formally thanked him, mentioned a couple of key points, asked Stephen a prearranged question to start the conversation, and then opened the discussion. She was lively, and the audience's attention remained riveted throughout. Just like Stephen's attention is on the woman in the peach suit, he almost forced himself not to look into her eyes, but when he did, her sparkling eyes and glossy lips, not bright red, but soft and perfect for her suit, smiled back at him. During the coffee break, Stephen found himself surrounded by people who wanted to ask him a question or get his advice on a particular situation, but were either embarrassed or did not have the opportunity to do so during the question and answer session. The entire time he was answering questions and listening, he was aware that his eyes had a mind of their own as they scanned the room looking for a peach-colored business suit. If she was nearby, she was nowhere to be seen. As the second meeting began and the delegates returned to the main conference room, Stephen stepped back a little, his eyes darting around the crowd trying to find her. With only a few people left, he was just about to enter the hall when she hurriedly entered through one of the other doors. Stephen held the door open, and she gave him a smile. The same smile that had almost stopped him in his tracks during his speech. She nodded her thanks and walked in to take her seat. Stephen tried to look at her name tag, but he was so embarrassed about not wanting to appear staring at her breasts that all he could do was catch the vague outline of letters and words, a short name and/or Pam, and a surname similar to Pinch. Stephen sat down in the empty seat next to the back desk. He flipped through the conference packet, half paying attention to the next speaker, who was talking about bullying with a particular focus on children with special needs. Ah, this is what I was looking for. He walked slowly through the list of delegates, ignoring the men and discarding the women, whose names didn't fit. Bingo, Ann Finch is an educational consultant. Finch, that's an unpleasant coincidence. Stephen shook his head ironically and pulled out his iPhone, Google, and here it is at the very bottom of the first page. Stephen followed the link and viewed it. Psychology, short teaching career, master's degree in education, doctorate at university. A bright girl, but it was visible in her eyes. While he was surfing the internet, Stephen checked his email, work. Lord, I need to have a social life. How many months have passed since he and Laura broke up? Well, it all just fizzled out. They both agreed that it was good and fun, but nothing happened. Since then, he had seen her a couple of times. They even had a very memorable encounter in bed. But it was all over. They both knew this and did not regret anything. Lunch came and went. Stephen kept looking for a peach suit with a perky smile, but Anne was nowhere to be seen. There were several workshops in the afternoon, and she was clearly in different groups than Stephen. After completing the activities planned for the day, Stephen went to his room and decided to work out in the gym before dinner. He did his usual warm-up on the exercise bike and did 10 minutes on the rowing machine before moving on to the treadmill. The hotel gym wasn't too bad, and as Stephen completed 5 kilometers of the 10K course, he looked out the large window overlooking the typically small hotel pool. She looked amazing, so much so that Stephen tripped on the treadmill and almost lost her. He heard a chuckle from the nearby treadmill and looked over. Yeah, she's bloody gorgeous, isn't she? Stephen grunted in response, something vaguely in agreement. His partner continued, I thought she looked good in that outfit today, but to see her in a bikini, damn it, Stephen couldn't agree more. He decided that he would not lift weights and would go for a swim after he completed the next 5 kilometers. As he clocked up the kilometers, he watched Anne cover sections of the pool with an ease that would have impressed Mark Spitz. Finally, the machine beeped and he slowed down, not a bad time, but not one that would bother any of the elite athletes. He changed into his swimming trunks, washed off his sweat, and tried to look casual as he entered the pool. The surface of the pool was a sheet of smooth glass. There was not a single swimmer who could disturb its surface, especially not a single blonde swimmer in a bikini. Damn, why did I bother with these last 5 kilometers? Stephen almost reluctantly disturbed the sleeping pool and took a few sluggish swims before exiting it, still angry at himself for the missed opportunity. Stephen was late for dinner. He looked around the bar. The DFES guys were nowhere to be seen, but neither was Anne. He entered the restaurant and looked around. He recognized several groups, but no one he knew that well. Well, it looks like you're dining alone. He told the waitress it would be just him, and she found him a table by the window. I hope you're going to eat well after running today. Stephen looked up from the menu and saw those eyes smiling at him as they seemed to do all today. Before he could answer, she gestured to the chair opposite. Can? Stephen stood up and said that, of course, she could join him. He smiled at her. I guess I'm not the only one who's worked up an appetite. You have swum a few lengths in the pool. Anyone would think that we were spying on each other. Her eyes and smile said, Yes, I know you've been looking for me all day. God, are women really that good at reading us? Or are we just bad at hiding it? Or maybe she's saying that because she knows that every man at the conference was paying attention to her. Anyway, the game is on. When she sat down, he looked at her. She was clearly the type of person who would look great dressed in a bag tied with twine. Her third outfit of the day, if a bikini can be called an outfit, was a simple white shirt and jeans that had been sprayed on. She was wearing the same gold and diamond earrings and necklace as before, but Stephen's heart sank when he noticed other jewelry. A simple engagement ring with a single diamond and an equally simple gold bracelet. So she's married. This wouldn't be the first married woman you've shared a bed with. But Stephen knew that downstream there were difficulties, guilt, and difficult decisions. They talked about fitness, swimming, gym, and dancing. Below these days, I don't have many opportunities for this, she said with a rather sad, distant look in her eyes. When Stephen asked why, she simply shrugged. This is probably because your husband keeps you on a leash at home. I know I would. She smiled a forced, weak smile, something like that. Hey, well, you touched a nerve, dude. Stephen changed the subject. They ordered food and ate while discussing Stephen's morning presentation. She clearly thought a lot about this. Her sharp mind asked Stephen some deep questions and challenged some of the things he said. God, beauty, and brains. That's a woman. So come on, stop working. Tell me about Mrs. Ann Finch. She laughed. God, you're good. You know how to win people over. You are a great listener and so easy to talk to. Stephen smiled and shrugged his shoulders like a naughty boy. Do you understand what I mean? Anne shook her head and began talking about school, university, teaching, her love of physical sports, work after graduation. She talked about meeting her husband. He came to school to teach the children rugby. Stephen felt his throat go dry and his stomach tighten. No, this can't be Finch and rugby. Oh my God. Stephen took a deep breath and in as correct a manner as he could muster from his dry mouth, with his heart pounding, asked, So, where was the school where you taught when you met? Oh, David was the coach of the local rugby club. The school was... Stephen barely heard the end of the sentence. As soon as she said David, he understood. He knew where the school was. The last piece of the puzzle fell. David Finch. David fucking Finch. He hurriedly grabbed the wine and took an oversized sip. He coughed. Are you okay? Sorry, it just didn't go there. It was his turn to smile weakly. She reached out and touched his arm, worrying, giving way to a smile in her eyes. When he assured her that he was fine, he turned his hand over and took her slender, graceful, immaculately manicured fingers in his. She did not try to pull her hand away, and her eyes again became sparkling and smiling. At that moment, he realized that they would sleep together. If not today, then someday. He knew it. She knew it. He looked at her. Bright, very bright, beautiful, stunningly beautiful. How could the bastard who tormented me as a teenager convince her to marry him? Stephen wanted to understand the relationship between Anne and that bastard for two reasons. He wanted Anne, but he knew that to do that, he would have to put any guilt he felt about cheating on David out of her head. To do this, he needed to understand their relationship. But he also wanted to know how he did it. This woman was far from stupid, so how could he deceive her? And did he mock her? One day a badass, they continued to hold each other's hands as they talked. Stephen gently stroked and caressed her hand as if it were made of precious, fine porcelain. They laughed together. They were serious together. They argued and agreed, and they grew closer with every sentence spoken. Then, as Stephen brought her hand to his lips, blew gently on it and kissed it. He heard an ahem from across the room. They both looked around. The restaurant was empty. The tables were set for breakfast. They were so carried away by each other that they did not notice that everyone had already left long ago. They walked from the restaurant to the elevators hand in hand, like lovers who had known each other for months. Stephen asked if she wanted another drink, saying that he had a very nice minibar in his room. She stopped, turned to face him, and took both his hands in hers. You have no idea how much I would like this, but I just can't. I'm sorry. The elevator beeped and took with it everything that Stephen was about to answer. They went inside. He pressed 10. She pressed 6. The doors closed and he gently pulled her into his arms, pressed his lips to hers, and the kiss was what he knew it would be. When he ran his hand over her chest, she let out a small sigh. Then the elevator stopped, and she pulled away from it, grinning. Stephen put his foot on the door to keep it from closing. Breakfast at 8? She lowered her eyes, then looked at him and smiled. What do you think? She then quickly stood on her tiptoes and kissed him on the cheek. This is as a sign of gratitude for a wonderful evening, and she turned and left, leaving the cloying smell of her perfume in Stephen's head. Stephen came down to breakfast at 8 o'clock in the morning. He noticed her at a small table by the window. Approaching her, He decided that she was even more magnificent than he had thought the day before. She was wearing a pink blouse and blue trousers, apparently the bottom half of a business suit. She spotted him a few yards away, flashed her black pool illuminate smile, stood up, and kissed him on the cheek. "Good morning, Dr. Barnes." Her perfume filled his head as he answered, "Good morning, Dr. Finch." He sat down, instinctively reaching across the table for her hand. "Looks like we're picking up where we left off." He nodded in agreement and smiled at her. Breakfast passed in light conversation and smiles. As they were leaving, he casually suggested that instead of having dinner at the hotel that night, why don't they go out somewhere? For a few seconds, that slightly haunted, melancholy look returned to her. "I would love to, but unfortunately I can't. I'm leaving at lunchtime today. I'm afraid I have to go back. The bottom has fallen out of Stephen's world." But you can't leave?" "Sorry, but I really need to leave." He grabbed her hand and turned her to face him, but when he saw the look in her eyes, everything he was going to say flew out of his head. He simply looked at her and nodded. At the first session, Stephen could not concentrate. He kept thinking about the previous evening. During a coffee break, he was ambushed by a group who wanted to discuss his presentation, and Anne was nowhere to be seen. Just like the previous day, she arrived when the break was over, and putting down her mobile phone, hurried to take her seat. The last session before the lunch break was a panel discussion. Stephen was in front on the panel. As questions were asked, one or the other group member answered. It wasn't him the entire time. Stephen's gaze was fixed on Anne, who was always looking at him. Those eyes, that smile, made his stomach hurt. So what do you think about this, Stephen?" "Oh, sorry, could you repeat that?" I got a little distracted, still thinking about the previous question. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught Anne's giggle and nearly missed the question a second time. In the end, he recovered spectacularly and was back in shape. When the session ended, he was again surrounded by people who wanted to discuss things with him. What the hell is going on with these people? There's free food here. Why don't they want to eat? To tell the truth, he didn't want to eat. He just wanted to say goodbye to Anne. Apologizing, he walked away. He looked around the dining room. No, not here. He ran down the stairs into the hall, just in time to see the wheels of the small suitcase that the same blue business suit was carrying disappear through the front door. He approached her as she opened the taxi door. "Aren't you going to say goodbye?" "You're surrounded, and I have a train that won't wait for me. Can I see you again?" She looked at him and her head tilted to one side, and the smile was like a spring morning. "You can't even imagine how much I would like this." Then the haunted look returned, and she looked at her shoes. "But I really can't." Then, in an echo of the previous evening, she stood up on her tiptoes, kissed him on the hot cheek, and turned to get into the taxi. Stephen never acted impulsively, but everything has its time. He grabbed her hand and pulled her towards him. Their lips met. She felt how her body tensed and thought that she would now pull away from him. A moment later, her entire body relaxed into the kiss. Half a minute later, she pulled away from him, touched his cheek, and without saying a word climbed into the taxi. Stephen watched her disappear in the direction of Euston. His mouth was dry and the emptiness inside turned into a cave. Every time Stephen checked his email in the days after the conference, he hoped that he would find a note from Anne. Nothing. Sure, he could have emailed her. He got her email address from the conference organizers, but no, the contact had to come from her. Then, a couple of weeks later, he was preparing a presentation when Outlook beeped and a message from Finch Anne appeared in the bottom left corner of the screen. Stephen read it 3 times, each time becoming more and more confused. What the hell is this? She wrote how much she enjoyed his performance and meeting him. She asked him about something that they discussed for a long time and came to a common opinion. She said she really hoped she can hear him speak again soon. It was all strange, friendly, but formal. She knew that he would. Remember this conversation? They even laughed at him at breakfast. "This is a code," she just says. "Hello, and I haven't forgotten you." All this added fuel to Stephen's suspicions regarding Anne and David Finch. 24 hours later, almost to the minute, another email arrived. Stephen almost ignored him. Almost ignored the letter that would change his life. It was not a letter from Anne, but from someone whose name he did not recognize, so he almost ignored it. But the only thing that saved the letter from shame in the deleted items folder was the title. Reminder, Class of '92 Reunion. He vaguely remembered that the same letter had arrived several weeks ago, but then he had not the slightest desire to return to meet his classmates. But now there was a very good reason to go. Revenge. He was going to go. He was sure David fucking Finch would be there, showing off his gorgeous, long-suffering wife. And he, Steven, was going to go and steal his wife right from under his nose. That kiss wasn't fake. He knew that she had feelings for him, and the encrypted letter proved this. Steven read the mail, just a few days off. In a few days, he will change everything. Revenge, payback for years spent in poverty. Steven was deliberately late in arriving. He didn't want to hang around waiting for Anne and David fucking Finch to arrive. He wanted them there. His senses were bombarded by the noise from the dance floor and the smells of perfume and aftershave. Some cheap, some very expensive. As for his eyes, all of his former classmates had changed. Some were recognizable and some were not. Steven squeezed his chest into an increasingly tight fist, and his mouth went dry. Come on, for the last 10 years you've been preaching about standing up to bullies. Now it's your turn. It's not that easy, is it? Get a grip, damn it. He looked around the room for her face. Too many people. Hello, Steve, isn't it? Yes, sorry. This is Alan. Remember? I didn't have a beard when I was 16. I'm glad to see you. And Alan left to surprise someone else. Steven looked at the dancing people. No, not there. Then the groups huddled around the bar. No, and not near food either. He knew it was her, although she was sitting with her back to him. A group of half a dozen people sat at a table. Steven took a deep breath, exhaled, and went to walk a few meters to meet his sworn enemy. David M.F. sat opposite his wife, facing Steven. As Steven approached, he raised his head. A smile, or was it a grin? Hi all, remember me? Anne's head jerked as if someone had pulled a string. Her mouth became oval. The two other seated men stood up to shake Steven's hand. Damn David Finch didn't move. Ignorant bastard. Steven looked him in the eye and extended his hand. Hello, David. Aye. And then he saw the wheels and stopped. Hey, Steve, I'm very glad you came. I know you know Anne. He laughed, a genuine laugh of amusement, not a smirk, although I see that she had no idea that we knew each other. Steven knew that his face must look the same as Anne's face a few minutes ago. For the first time in many years, he was completely speechless. Come on, Steve. Or is it Steven now? Come on, I'll buy you a drink. Anne stood up, but David shook his head. It's okay. Steven can push me through the crowd. One of the benefits of being disabled is that people try to avoid you. Steven didn't need to push. David's upper body was probably as good as anyone else's that evening, and he handled the wheelchair with ease. They took their drinks, but instead of returning to the table, David headed outside. We need to talk. The cool air mixed with the smell of smoke from an outcast group of smokers helped Steven bring order to his racing thoughts. First things first. So what happened? In a rugby match, a turning point occurred. Everything, and I mean everything below the belt. David shook his head. Disappeared. Died. Nothing. Steven shook his head. How many times had he wished for something like this to happen? And then it happened. God forgive me. It's not worth it. Things happen, but it is I who must apologize to you. I wish I had been man enough to do this years ago when I realized what a total bastard, a real piece of shit I was to you and a few others. But you were the easiest target, and I'm truly sorry. At first, I thought it was a condemnation of me for not looking for you to apologize. We all do things that we later regret. For God's sake, Steve, I was a complete asshole. At least make me happy that you hate me at least a little. Steven laughed and nodded. Yes, you were, and I hated you more than you can imagine. Thanks for this. David extended his hand, and Steven couldn't believe the warmth he felt when he took it and shook his tormentor's hand. But there is something else. Anne. Steven sat down on the low wall that surrounded the parking lot. Their eyes were now at the same level. Nothing happened. We met and got along well. Shrug. In. She really likes you, you know? Over the past 3 weeks, she's mentioned you probably 100 times. I have to admit, I was stunned when I realized who Steven was. David. Nothing happened. Oh, I know that. She's wonderful, and I don't deserve her. She would never ever do anything to hurt me. But I know her well enough to know that she really likes you, and... Hello. What's happening? Both men were so engrossed in conversation that they did not notice Anne leave. David held out his hand and she took it. On time, baby. Steve, I'm sorry. Steven and I were just talking about you. I was just about to ask him to do me a favor, so to speak. And since this concerns you, maybe it's good that you're here. My God, I know what he's gonna say. Oh Christ. David looked into his wife's eyes. I know that you loved me. I know that you will never do anything bad to me. But I also know that you are a young woman. A woman with, how can I say this more politely? A woman with needs that this useless husband cannot satisfy. David, and cut in. But David raised his hand and continued. I've really been thinking about this a lot since you came back from the conference and mentioned my old school friend here. I know you like Stephen, and I know you'll never cheat on me. It's just not in your nature, but you don't cheat if it happens with my permission, and I know about it. Anne shook her head. Stephen looked at his nemesis. Let's talk about how to dump coals of fire on the head of your enemy. And then Stephen looked at each other for the second time in a short period of time. He was speechless. Listen, you too. I'm not suggesting that you're going to jump into bed tonight. But if you want, that's great. Just don't be afraid to see each other. And let what happens happen. Stephen spoke first. I just don't know what to say. I know that you like each other. Just get to know each other better. And if in 2 years she wants you and not me, then that's life. Like I said, things happen. It's not just my happiness that's at stake. This is Anne's happiness and yours. And I gave you 7 years of absolute hell. David shrugged and smiled. Time to pay? Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.